Kia ora, everyone, and greetings from Toronto, Canada, from my side of the world to yours. I've met many of you over the years at various trade union events in New Zealand. I'm very fond of the work that the Public Service Association in New Zealand does to promote the interests of your members and promote a more just and inclusive New Zealand. So thank you for those efforts, and I'm glad to join you today, even if remotely, by this video message. Of course, Canada and New Zealand have a lot in common. Both beautiful countries, great scenery, lots of natural resources. We each have a reputation for social equality, not always deserved, of course, and that's what we're trying to change with our respective labor movements. And of course, one other thing that Canada and New Zealand have in common, we live right next to much bigger neighbors, dominant neighbors, powerful neighbors. Neighbors full of arrogant wankers who think they know everything and we know nothing. But of course, we can deal with that too, and we're each building good solidarity with our brothers and sisters in the American and Australian labor movements. So that was just a joke. Anyways, I also send official best wishes to the Public Service Association from our union, Unifor. It's a new union in Canada, formed in 2013. 310,000 members strong, and we're trying to push the envelope of trade unionism and modern organizing and mobilizing and outreach techniques, just as I know you are. Now, before we get started with the serious content, I want to put up a few links for you who are interested in any further information. Here's my Twitter handle, @JimboStanford. I'm a real Twitter guy. I love to send out messages, many of them to do with Canada, but many of them internationally. The next two are links to Canadian resources, Canadian progressive research sites, the Centre for Policy Alternatives and the Progressive Economics Forum. Those are both research institutes that I've been involved with that put out a lot of good information. Again, a lot on Canada, but some of them with interest and application to New Zealand. Then the last site there, economicsforeveryone.ca, that's a site that goes with my book, Economics for Everyone, which was meant to be a non-technical textbook in economics for trade union members and others who are working for social justice. And there's all kinds of resources on that site, including lecture notes, glossaries, student exercises for union educators to help bring ourselves up to speed on economic issues. Because we all know economics is too important to be left to the economists. We all have to get a handle on economic debates in our movement if we're going to win the arguments we're having with governments, employers, and businesses. One more link I just want to make a reference to, which was a book that just came out in New Zealand, Beyond the Free Market, Rebuilding a Just Society, just in time for your elections, of course. And this comes from Dunmore Publishing, and there's several chapters from trade unionists in New Zealand, and one from me. I was invited to give my views on New Zealand society in a chapter called A View from Afar. So check out that book. You know, one funny thing about this presentation today, I'm taping this before your election. Your election isn't until next week when I'm taping this, but by the time you see this, you'll have had the election, and so you'll already know the results. So anyways, my best wishes in advance for a good outcome from that. And I do want to commend the work of the whole movement, including the CTU and its Get Out and Vote campaign, which I watched closely and I think was a very effective and modern way for unions to try and engage in politics with their members. Now, they say that economics is the dismal science, and that name, that nickname, if you like, is often very well deserved. Orthodox economists, the ones who are trained in the theory of free markets and supply and demand, they seem to take joy, they seem to relish in talking about scarcity and the shortage of resources in the world and the need for us to constantly tighten our belts. In fact, the famous definition of economics made by the British economist Lord Robbins defines it as studying the relation of given ends to scarce means. Well, in modern times, of course, that whole emphasis on scarcity takes form in the politics of austerity, which have been dominant in so much of the world, especially since the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. Austerity is the response of the rich and powerful in all of our societies to the fiscal problems and other consequences of that financial crisis. And remember, that was a crisis that was caused by the rich and powerful. It was not caused by workers, whether in the private sector or the public sector. It was not caused by our wages or our benefits or our pensions. It was caused by allowing people with too much money to play without adult supervision in unregulated financial casinos around the world. Yet, you know, when the chickens came home to roost and the whole system melted down, they came to try to make us pay for a crisis that we didn't create. And that's exactly what austerity is. And I know you're confronting that argument in New Zealand, just as we are in Canada, North America, in Europe, Asia, and elsewhere. The whole idea is that we must make do with less. We can't afford things anymore that we used to take for granted. We have to take less wages and benefits in our jobs. We have to take a smaller social wage, by which I'm referring to the value of all of the public services that are produced and consumed in our societies. And we have to make do with less security, less stability. We have to face facts that we live in an uncertain world and be prepared to lose our jobs at any given point in time. This sense of fatalism, that there's nothing we can do about it, is what I think is the most negative aspect of modern economics as it's taught. The idea that we are powerless. It's just a matter of economics. It's a matter of supply and demand. These trends are inevitable and irresistible. Well, I beg to differ fundamentally. There's nothing inevitable about the current state of the world economy, and there's nothing inevitable about the idea that we have to tighten our belts and make do with less. And to show this, I just want to start with a very simple little economics lesson. The reality is, if we look at the economy and the goods and services that we produce, it's actually rather simple. All production starts with the resources and materials which we are able to harvest from nature. That's the first step. And of course, we have to pay attention that we're doing that in a sustainable way without running down the quality of the natural environment. Then, every value-added step of production, where we take those gifts from nature and then transform them into useful goods and services, has one key ingredient, and that is work, our productive human effort. And that can be the work that we do with our bodies, with our physical capacity to labor, our brawn, if you like. But it's also the work that we do with our heads, our brains, our ability to conceptualize and think and solve problems and communicate. That work is the source of all the value added in our economy. And what we call the gross domestic product, or the GDP, is nothing more and nothing less than the sum total of the value added as a result of all our work. So never mind all the fancy graphs and charts about quarterly GDP statistics or the ups and downs of financial markets. When we're talking about the economy, we're actually just talking about that four-letter word, W-O-R-K, work. And it does seem like a four-letter word on Monday morning when we have to drag our sorry asses out of bed and get to our job. But the reality is, no matter where we're working, we are the source of value added in the economy. We are the source of production. We are the force that makes the economy go round. So when we're thinking about production and value, we're going to define work in a very broad, inclusive way to simply refer to any type of productive human effort. So that comes in different kinds. We could be producing goods, tangible products that we can hold in our hand, or we can be producing services, that is, useful things that we perform for other people. We could be doing it in the private sector for a private company. We could be working in the public sector, as most of your members do, funded by a government or a public agency. Some of the work we do requires high skills and university degrees. Some of it requires less formal education, although I doubt the idea that there's a lot of so-called unskilled work. Every job involves skills and capacity and stamina, and every worker deserves security and decent compensation for what they do. We also have unpaid work that goes on in our economy. Think of the work we do in our homes, cleaning the home and caring for people in the home, or the volunteer work in our communities. I'm so broad and open-minded on what constitutes work, I will even include management, sometimes, when they're doing something useful, like organizing production, solving problems, making sure that we've got the necessary supplies, and so on. Those are all the different forms of work that ultimately add up to the value added in our total economy. And that's a key lesson that is often forgotten when people are saying that there's nothing we can do, we have to make do with less. Now, the value of work and the potential of work to add value in our economy is equally true in the public sector as in the private sector, as I mentioned. In the public sector, work is the only force that creates the services, mostly services, that are produced in the public sector for the benefit of the citizens who consume those services, whether it's students in a classroom or patients in a hospital or citizens consuming any of the other public services that are produced by your members. Those public services are essential to our quality of life. They are meaningful forms of consumption. They add directly to our material standard of living. They supplement the things that we can buy with the money wage in our pocket. And also, they're very, very important in moderating inequality. If you look at the statistics, the fact that poor people in our societies can consume a certain amount of the output of the economy through their access to universal public services adds dramatically to their standard of living and helps to reduce the level of inequality in our society. So on that basis, we can immediately bust a number of the myths that are always repeated about public sector work. Public services are not a waste, a drain on our economy, a cost item. In fact, public services add. They add to GDP, they add to incomes, they add to our living standards. And jobs in the public sector are not wasteful jobs. They're not bureaucrats sitting around. In fact, jobs in the public sector are high productivity, generate wealth, and generate incomes. And anyone who works in a public sector occupation knows the value of what they're doing, and they should feel proud of the contribution that they make to the real economy of New Zealand. Let's look at a simple picture of the economic benefits of public service provision once the chain of value creation and income generation is set in motion. Let's start with a simple public service, in this case, someone in a daycare center or a school. That person gets paid for their work. Okay, and of course, as all of you know, a good chunk of your income is immediately paid back to government in the form of taxes. So there's one flow of money that comes right back to government from public service delivery. Secondly, what are public servants very good at in addition to earning their income through providing public services? They're very good at taking their income and going out shopping with it, spending every penny and sometimes more thanks to the magic of credit cards. So the public servants go to the store, they spend their income buying goods and services. That generates more revenue for government in the form of sales taxes on your purchases. Plus, it puts incomes into the pockets of the retail sector and all the industries which supplied the retail sector. And they pay taxes that go to government. Finally, remember, the school and any other public service operation buys inputs, goods and services of different kinds, supplies, maintenance services, utilities, etc., from companies operating in the private sector. And those companies, in turn, pay taxes to government on their new incomes. So look at all the spin-off benefits that happened because the government put in place the fiscal basis for providing public services. On a total basis, looking at all of those spin-off effects, economists estimate a multiplier effect of about 1.5 to 1. What that means is every dollar that's spent on providing a public service tends to generate on average about $1.50 in GDP across the whole economy, counting those various spin-off effects. Now remember, the government in New Zealand gets back about 33 cents on every dollar of GDP. That's the average revenue take for government. That means if you're getting back 33% on the $1.50 of GDP resulting from $1 in spending on public services, the government's getting back about half of the cost of providing the public service just in the fiscal payback to government that results from all of those spin-off effects. So public service provision is an essential part of the prosperity of any modern nation, including New Zealand. It is not a drain, it contributes to our wealth. Let's get back to that idea of scarcity that motivates orthodox economists and that underpins the modern discussion about austerity in today's debates. What is actually scarce in our economy then? Once we've recognized that our labor, productive human effort, is the source of all the value added that's generated in our economy. It isn't money that's scarce, far from it. Our banking system creates money out of thin air every time it issues a new loan to someone. It isn't capital that's scarce. Capital is simply money that's used by a business in undertaking some kind of new production. As long as businesses are willing to invest, the banking system can supply capital immediately. It isn't even government revenues that are scarce. because of course government revenues reflect political decisions and choices that are made about who's going to pay taxes and how much they're going to pay. This whole idea of scarcity has really become, I think, ethereal in the wake of the global financial crisis. Governments in many countries in the world, including the United States, the UK, Japan, Europe, have taken up a new technique called quantitative easing, where their central banks are literally printing trillions of dollars of new spending power out of thin air to help those economies recover from the recession. So anyone who says that there's nothing out there, there's nothing you can do about fiscal constraints, we just have to tighten our belts, forgets the fact that when government chooses to, it can create enormous amounts of spending power out of thin air. The problem is we don't necessarily use that power for the things that it's required for. So ultimately, the only thing that is scarce in our society, in our economy, is our capacity to work. Is everybody working? Is everybody working the number of hours that they want and could work? Are they working to the best of their ability, using their skills as productively as possible? And, importantly, are we taking the output of our labor, the goods and services that we produce, and using them wisely to make the citizens of our country better off? In New Zealand, of course, official unemployment is around 6%, but that doesn't tell the whole story. Another 4% at least are underemployed, and that doesn't count people who've given up looking and hence have disappeared from the official statistics. If New Zealand really focused on putting everyone to work in both the private sector and the public sector, the value added from that work would generate billions of dollars in new income, billions of dollars in new tax revenue for government, and a much more prosperous society. Of course, we always confront this argument that the deficit made us do it, that governments have their hands tied by a fiscal problem. Of course, deficits did occur in the wake of the recession, the global crisis. That happens automatically when the economy goes into a downturn because fewer people are paying taxes and some expenses go up. But that isn't the end of the world. If a deficit results from those cyclical problems rather than from a structural mismatch between taxes and spending, then simply putting people back to work will automatically take care of the deficit. And any debt that was incurred in the meantime is entirely acceptable. Again, if it reflects cyclical problems in the economy, or if the debt is incurred in order to pay for investments in valuable public assets like infrastructure. If the debt is stable as a share of GDP and if interest rates are low, both of those conditions are clear today, then there's no need to lose any sleep whatsoever about debts and deficits, and the fiscal issue should not hold back a society from making the investments in public services that it needs. Here's a graph that shows the evolution of New Zealand's public debt as a share of GDP. It declined very dramatically over the decades. Then it hit bottom and started to rise again modestly with the global financial crisis, but it's still under 10% of New Zealand's GDP. That's far, far lower than the debt burdens faced by other countries in Europe or the United States or Japan, some of where debt is more than 100% of GDP. So when the government says we cannot afford to provide this essential public service, yes, it would contribute to your standard of living, but we just can't pay for it. They're absolutely lying. New Zealand has among the strongest fiscal capacity of any country in the world. It comes back to this kind of what I call an animal farm theory about debt. Remember in Animal Farm, the famous book by George Orwell, they said, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. The same simple-minded approach is applied to discussions about debt. The whole idea, private debt good, public debt bad. We all know that households and businesses borrow money if they're going to make long-run productive investments, and so they should. But what about governments? Why can't governments borrow money if they're going to invest in things that improve our capacity to produce in the future? In fact, they can and should. And that simple-minded focus on public debt has led New Zealand to ignore debt problems that are actually much, much worse, such as your foreign indebtedness. Your private sector's indebtedness to the rest of the world is actually very high. Your public debt, compared to other countries, is very low. Now, the problem with the whole vision of austerity is its approach is very self-defeating. They say, well, the recession caused the deficit because taxes went down and expenses went up. So we'll solve the problem with austerity by cutting back the amount that's spent on different public services. The problem is, remember, public services themselves are an important contributor to the economy. So if you're going to cut away public services and lay off public sector workers, you're going to undermine GDP growth and make the recession even worse. At best, many of the so-called savings that result from cutbacks are lost because of the macroeconomic spin-offs. At worst, you can actually worsen the recession by dramatic cutbacks in public spending. And that's exactly what we've seen in Greece and some other countries in Europe, where the medicine ended up being worse than the disease itself. So let me conclude with just a few points on how I think we can fight against austerity and we can win that fight. The first point is to debunk that self-defeating logic of austerity. Cutting back services, cutting back public programs, laying off public sector workers is not going to solve the problem. In fact, it will make the economic problem worse. Secondly, quite apart from the economic consequences, we have to reject the human and social consequences. Those public services are an essential component of our standard of living, and we must demand that our kids be educated, our patients be cared for, our cities and our communities be maintained. Those consequences of cutbacks are unacceptable. Third of all, we can reclaim our rightful role as the source of value added, as the source of wealth in our economy, and remind people that our work, including the work of public sector employees, is the essential force that drives the economy forward. Finally, we can argue that by putting people back to work, including the hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders who are unemployed, underemployed, or who've left the labor force altogether, putting those people back to work will generate all of the income, all the government revenues, all the prosperity we need. There's absolutely no argument for austerity and belt tightening. New Zealand's economy, like Canada's economy, can afford every public service it used to provide and then some, because the real economic capacity of our countries is better and stronger than ever. And on that argument, I hope that your union, like my union, will have some great successes in the years ahead, fighting that self-defeating logic of austerity. Thank you for what you're doing. Know that you have our solidarity from Canada in your fight. Bye-bye.